president of the Hastings Center, and I have the really the great privilege of introducing our speaker for tonight, David Brooks. I will also mention another David connected to the Hastings Center. That is David Roscoe, who is sitting right here. David is chairman of our board now. Recently succeeding Harold Edgar, who's sitting 2 rows behind. David Roscoe will be the person who brings the evening to a close, but I get the fun part, which is to introduce David Brooks. So, at the Hastings Center, we value complex thoughts and unpredictability. That is, if someone is a truly creative thinker who takes seriously the relevant facts of the matter and is willing to think seriously about the moral and political dimensions of issues, you're not always going to be able to tell where they're going to come out. But you know that the journey is going to be an interesting one, and you're going to learn something from watching the process of that journey. Around the table at the Hastings Center, I think I would say my favorite, and I think this would be true of many of my colleagues, the most provocative and consistently interesting and unpredictable political commentator of this age is David Brooks. Let me read you something that we would be proud to have written. Quote, "It's easy to get lost in the weeds when talking about healthcare reform. But like all great public issues, the healthcare debate is fundamentally a debate about values. It's a debate about what kind of country we want America to be." I resoundingly agree with that. The Hastings Center did a report on connecting American values to healthcare, but we didn't write this, David Brooks did. And we were thrilled to see this echoing of the theme of the centrality of values in our national discourse about all policy issues, but particularly healthcare. David also wrote a wonderful column building on the work done by the research group at the Hastings Center on behavioral genetics, led by Eric Perrins, who's here this evening. I don't know if you remember that one, David, but I have it if you need a reminder. David has been recently thinking a great deal about what the neurosciences and research in the behavioral sciences of decision-making and the neurosciences teach us about who we are and what is possible for us in our economics and our society and our politics. And David is a week away from completing a book that it does not yet have a formal title, but if it's something close to the title of tonight's lecture, we won't be surprised. He's been thinking a lot about the revolution in the neurosciences and American civic life. And that said, I want to welcome David Brooks. Thank you.
Thank you. I vividly remember the column on behavioral genetics. I had a chapter on genetics in the book, and I took it out because it was too complex and confusing. I have no memory of writing that thing about values. I don't know. That must have been Frank Rich. First, it's sort of a pleasure for me to be back here in this building. The New York Times building I mentioned upstairs. It's been a little while since I've been in this building. They've moved the door since I've been here. So they've kept some of the old artwork. Behind me, there's a picture of Tom Friedman and Frank Rich and Maureen Dowd doing a vaguely homoerotic dance, as they were wont to do around the aisle. No, I'm just kidding. It is strange how one gets here. I grew up in Stuyvesant Town on 14th Street. I went to Grace Church School. I was part of the all-Jewish boys davening choir there. Actually, I'll tell a couple quick stories about, I'm just reminded of them. First, about being a Jew at Grace Church. We were not the most religiously observant family on earth, and so I was in the choir, but we would sing all the words, God is already angry. We would sing all the words to the hymns, the Jews, but we wouldn't sing the word Jesus. And so the volume would drop, and then it would come back up. So then I went to the University of Chicago. I met a young Protestant woman. We were married. 3 years later, after our marriage, she announces she wants to convert to Judaism. Then she announces she wants to study to become a rabbi. Now we keep kosher at home. We send our kids to Jewish day school. My line is, this is how we know God exists, because only he would go so far out of his way to screw me this badly. The other thing Stuyvesant Town brings to mind, when I was a kid, my father was teaching at NYU in the village, and they were somewhat left-wing. My grandmother, who was at an art gallery in the village, served hash brownies to my parents on their wedding reception, which was somewhat to the left. And in their mid-60s or so, they took me to a bee-in in Central Park where hippies would just go to bee. And part of the beeing was they set a garbage can on fire and threw their wallets into it to demonstrate their liberation from money and material things. And I was 5, and I saw a $5 bill on fire in the garbage can, and I ran up and grabbed it and ran away, which was my first step over to the right. It took a little while to latch onto. I'll talk about that a little later. But it's odd coming back in this room, this building, where I had a fateful lunch. I was asked by Gail Collins and Arthur Sulzberger to come to lunch. I sort of knew they were going to ask me to become a columnist, and I swore on the train ride up here I would not do it because I hate writing at 800 words, and I just didn't want to do it. And they asked me, and I said, well, has anybody ever said no to that question? Do you want to be a columnist for the New York Times? And they said no, and I had a failure of courage and said yes. And my last joke about that is being a conservative of the New York Times is like being the chief rabbi at Mecca. So it's sometimes a little lonely on the op-ed page there. It's not totally fair. But anyway, I came into this job. For 6 months, and I deleted my email folder, and I had 290,000 emails. And the essential message of them was, Paul Krugman is great, you suck. So that did 2 things. Coming to the Times did 2 things. One, it made me more psychologically fragile than I used to be. And 2, it gave me access. I'd always had some access to politicians, but when you work for the Times, you have tremendous access. And I got to see politics from a much closer vantage point than I ever had before. And when I took the job, Robert Novak actually gave me a good piece of advice, which was interview 3 politicians every day. And I don't always meet that criteria, but I come close. I spend a lot of time with politicians. Whenever an academic goes into government and comes out, or in government, I always ask him or her, you know, what you learned being in that you didn't know, just studying it from the outside. And I get a lot of answers. The most common, by the way, is that our military people are much more impressive than I thought they were. The level of our intelligence is much lower than I thought it was. But this fellow answered, you know, I used to think government was about 70% psychology and relationships. Now I realize it's 98% psychology and relationships. Just to get anything passed, it's not really about the interests, it's about the personal relationship of people in power. And having been around these people, I can tell you they're all emotional freaks of one sort or another. Politicians have what I call logorrhea dementia, which is they talk so much they drive themselves insane. When you go up to meet them, they will invade your personal space. So they'll grab you by the lapels, they'll rub the back of your head as they're talking to you. I had dinner with a Republican senator many months ago now who had his hand on my thigh the whole meal, squeezing it for emphasis. I once saw Ted Kennedy and Dan Quayle meet in the well of the Senate, and they hugged each other, and faces were like this far apart, and hands were moving up and down, sort of bumping and grinding there, and I was like, you know, get a room, I don't want to see this. But they have these intense social antennae, and if they don't have it naturally, they fake it. I was covering Mitt Romney up in New Hampshire in the last primary season, and we were at a diner in a small town in New Hampshire, and he was campaigning with his 5 perfect sons, Bip, Chip, Rip, Tip, Lip, and Bip. And he goes to the diner, he goes around each table, and he introduces himself to the people and asks them what village in New Hampshire they're from. And they tell him, and he describes the home he owns in their little village. And then he goes around, and we leave after about a half hour, and as he's waving, he first names every single person he's just met, 30 of them or so. And so that's social antenna. They have this feel for what other people want. And they can go in a room and they think, I know what they want. I can intuit what they want. And at some level, that's impressive. The downside of that intense social antennae is they are clannish. And the thing that has surprised me most, especially these days, is if you go to Washington and go to the Senate, or especially the House, it really is a team sport. They go to these team lunches every Tuesday. They call them policy lunches, where a pollster gets up and gives them the message of the week, and they are supposed to mimic the team. And so you get these cultish, and they're very emotional meetings with crying, and they're sort of evangelical call to Jesus meetings. And the psychodynamics of those meetings are incredibly intense. But as a result, that explains some of the intense polarization, because to be loyal to the team, you have to be 100% with the team. And you adopt the mentality of the team, and the people on the other team are strangers to you. And that's genuinely the case in Congress. I read a book several years ago, which is an extreme version of this, but it was called Machete Season by a French journalist who interviewed people from Rwanda who had committed the genocide there. And one of the guys she interviewed had decapitated his neighbor of 25 years. And she said, what was it like at that moment? And he said, you know, at the moment, I didn't see him as my neighbor. I saw him as an entity sort of abstracted away from the person I'd lived next to all that years. And that's obviously an extreme version. But I think that sort of internal transformation does explain some of the weird psychology that exists in Capitol Hill. And so having this closer access to politicians has really given me a psychological vantage point into politics, much more than I had before, and into President Obama. I'm 7 days younger than Obama. We lived and went to the same meetings in Chicago when he was an activist, and I was a young journalist there. And I've got to know him mostly in the Senate, somewhat since he's been in the White House, and his psychology has always been amazing to me. He is, in the first place, a very nice person, and this administration is a very nice administration. Usually when you attack a candidate or a president or a politician, the staff calls you the next morning and they'll say, you know, David, you're a complete and total idiot. With the Obama people, with their ethos, they'll call you the next morning and they'll say, David, we really like you, we respect your work. It's so sad you're a complete and total idiot. And so that makes you feel better about them. And they'll call them literally every Monday and Thursday. I get a call. Are we going to see good David or bad David tomorrow? But the other side of his personality, well, there are a couple. One I'll mention very quickly is the intense calmness of the guy. Bob Schieffer told me a story. This was in the presidential debates. Obama and McCain get to their podiums, or podii for those who went to U of Chicago. No, I'm just kidding. And McCain writes his talking points out. Obama doesn't, but when Schieffer asks him a question in a presidential debate, he just picks up his pen and writes something on the paper. So one of Schieffer's assistants goes to the podium after the debate to get the legal pad as a souvenir, and it's a plain white piece of paper with just a series of straight lines. So every time Schieffer had asked him a question, he'd just drawn a straight line through the paper. And if you can do that in a presidential debate, you are a calm guy. And you're also a self-confident guy. And this, to me, is the most important trait in this White House. I'm convinced that in 80 years, the word Obama will be the unit of measure for self-confidence. So we'll say, oh, he has 80 Obamas, he has 120 Obamas. And, you know, one of these quotes he says in private occasionally seep out in public. One of them was reported in the New Yorker by Ryan Lizza, and this is Obama talking to an aide. He said something like, you know, I'm a better speechwriter than any of my speechwriters. I know more about policy in any particular policy area than any of my policy directors, and I'm a much better political analyst than my political analysts. And if you could say that about yourself, you're reasonably self-confident. And he has that. And it has the good side and the bad side. The good side is that a real culture of debate in the White House. The bad side is a tendency to think that if he and the 5 other people equally smart as him get together in a room, they can solve any problem from the center. It is extremely self-confident. I mean, he's hired incredibly smart people, Half of them come from Harvard, half come from Yale. If we're attacked during the Harvard-Yale game, we're screwed because they'll be up there in New Haven. But the downside is, I think, that they really think that, oh, General Motors, no problem, we can take care of that. They have a greater faith than I do in centrally planned technocracy. And I would say also, and this is something that's really occurred to me in the last couple of weeks, is that every administration wears down their human capital the longer they're in power, because there's just no time to read, there's no time to think. And so they get less impressive as time goes by. Because the Obama people were the most impressive people I'd ever covered in a White House, the degradation, I think, is actually a little sharper as they recite the talking points, which everybody in government does. So I'm stressing the psychology of what I do every day and the intense social antennae of the people I cover every day. And that social antennae really overshadows their raw intelligence, to be honest. People in government in general are smart enough, but it's really their social feel. And what frustrates me about covering politics very often is they don't take advantage of their social antennae when passing policy. When they cross into the analysis of policy, too often they become third-rate economists. And economics has become the gateway between research and policy making, so that every single piece of research on how we behave gets translated through the language of classical economics before it can make it into a congressional hearing. If you went to a congressional hearing, am I too low here?
I'm just going to turn you up a little bit.
Okay. I had a knob in my back. I thought he was going to get that one. If you mentioned the word love at a congressional hearing, they'd look at you like you were Oprah. And to be serious, you have to talk like Samuelson. And to me, this has produced some terrible social effects which have really marked the politics and the policies I've covered my entire career. I started out as a reporter in Chicago, and really the transformational political experience for me was covering Chicago in the early 1980s and late 1970s, starting really at housing projects like Cabrini Green, which were designed to create the efficiency of living, totally ignorant of the social bonds of the communities that were destroyed and unable to come into being in these horrible projects. I then covered welfare policies which had some benefits, but especially in the early days, were oblivious to the effect on the institution of marriage as an institution. And what's happened very often in the neighborhoods that I covered is that marriage as a part of the social script of life has simply dropped away from that social script. And so now, 72% of African American kids are born out of wedlock, 55% of Latino kids, and among whites with high school degrees, 45%, which is the part that's moving up most quickly now. Then you go to education. I covered education policy since 1983, the Nation at Risk report, and we've really had 25 years of bureaucratic finagling trying to reorganize the education system. Big schools, small schools, charters, vouchers, all this sort of bureaucratic reshuffling, none of it focusing on the core, what we now understand as the core relationship, which is the relationship between the teacher and the child. People learn from people they love, and if you don't have that core relationship, then you're not going to get much. And because of the sort of anti-emotional attitude of people in policy, we never were willing to talk about that core relationship until very recently. And so this is, and then I can go on. In Russia, I covered the decline of the Soviet Union. And again, when the Soviet Union declined, Moscow in particular was filled with Western economists with privatization plans. I used to think you could go into a restroom in Moscow at a hard currency restaurant, and you could come out and say, did anybody leave a privatization plan in the restroom? And every single person in the restaurant would go like this, because they all had them. And yet, what we were all oblivious to was what Moscow was lacking was not privatization plans, it was social trust. When you went to an apartment in Moscow, the apartments were very nice internally. When you went out into the vestibule, where there might be like 4 doors, it would smell of urine, the lights would be out, nobody would have cleaned it in years. And you'd ask the people in the apartment, why don't you get together with your neighbors and clean the vestibule? And they would say, well, I don't like him, so-and-so's a drunk, and they would have lame excuses. But the reality was that because they didn't know who was KGB, and social trust had been utterly destroyed. And we've seen the results of that when you try to create a society without social trust, without strong government. And then finally, Iraq. You know, I once had a conversation, this was off the record, with a senior Bush administration official, and I said to her, didn't you think you got the culture of Iraq wrong? And she said, well, I don't really believe in culture. If you change institutions, you'll change the society. And that may be the right answer for some political scientists, but I don't think it was the right answer. The World Values Survey after the invasion went in, and they asked people in Iraq, as they do all around the world, would you mind if a foreigner moved next door to you? And in the US, 8% would mind, or say they would mind, 16% globally. In Iraq, 91% said they would mind. Because a traumatized society tends to be a xenophobic society. And they'd been traumatized by 30 years of Saddam, or whatever it was. And it would have been helpful to know that. It would have been helpful to understand the relationship between the Sunnis and the Shia. And yet, it's the same blindness coming back again and again. An overly simplistic view of human nature based on an old-fashioned classical social science model that people are autonomous individuals driven in relatively straightforward ways by incentives. And this worldview, which is really the worldview of the world I live in, misses the spaces between people. And as a result, in problem after problem, it misses the nature and quality of relationships. In the financial crisis, it misses the likelihood of emotional contagions taking over a whole industry and leading to one-way bets. In the consumer marketplace, it misses the nature of really cultural shifts in cultural norms. One of the things that's interests me that I don't quite understand is in 1950, they asked high school students, do you consider yourself an important person? And 12% of high school students said yes. In 2007, they asked the same question, Gallup did, and 80% said they were important. And that's a shift. I'm not quite sure what it means, but that is a shift. And they're easier to pin down shifts. If you look at consumption patterns throughout the 20th century, they go along like this, and then starting about 82, 83, they just zoom upward. So personal debt, which was about 45% of GDP, zooms up to 145% of GDP over 20 or 30 years. That is a genuine social shift, which doesn't seem to have any clear material cause. I think it has to do with social norms and how we define ourselves through consumption. But that's the sort of change that the policy world, with its overly materialistic view, is going to be blind to. And this is true of liberals and conservatives. And then finally, I think there's been a shift, there was a shift away from character talk. There was a view, and this goes back to the founding in some respects, that it was possible to build a just society without worrying about character and morality and just people, that if you orchestrated it correctly. And so this was a view that seemed to me bankrupt, leading to generation after generation of disappointing policies. And so you're looking around for a deeper and richer view of human nature that will actually explain the world you're covering. And so in my case, I drifted over into a world I never thought I would drift into. And that's the world of science. I was a horrible science student, as will become evident in a few minutes. But there are things going on in a world that are explaining things that the world I'm used to, the world of policy, cannot explain. And I really date the beginning of an intellectual shift to the work of Kahneman and Tversky years ago, maybe to some of the neuroscientific work, Antonio Damasio. There's the whole range in the last 30 years, not only with neuroscience, I use that as sort of a shorthand, but really including psychology, sociology, anthropology, cognitive scientists, behavioral economics, a whole neuroeconomics, if you want to include that, a whole range of fields, all shining their light into the way we think and giving us a deeper view of human nature. And to some, I was just at a conference, to some this revolution in cognition, or our understanding of cognition, is materialistic. It seeks to reduce everything to dendrites and synapses. But to me, when I read this stuff, it has the exact opposite impression. To me, it gives us a world into emotion, into the mystery of humanity, and into moral thinking. And so for some, it's narrowing and materialistic. but to me it's extremely humanistic and informing on that form. And to me, one of the findings that I found most useful in trying to apply that world to this world is the thing which runs through so much of the work, which is the concept of dual systems, dual processes. One process being conscious, which I sort of think of as it's as a general atop a platform looking out on reality from a distance and using a mode of analysis which is logical, linear, and linguistic. And that's the conscious mind. And then the unconscious mind, which is, to me, is more like a million scouts going out into the environment and no distance between the scouts and the environment, permeating other minds, permeating situations, and sending back instantaneous perceptions, coding things which they encounter with emotions. Some things are scary. If you see a friend, you get affection. If you see a mountain view, you get awe. If you see heroism, you get admiration. And these are instantaneous, simultaneous reactions which are relatively automatic, which combine perception, judgment, reaction, impulse in the nature of aesthetic systems. And to me, it is the sophistication of unconscious processes which are so deeply emotional, deeply social, and really illuminate a lot of the behavior I cover. And so much of the work by many people, there's a guy named Timothy Wilson at the University of Virginia, there's a Dutch guy whose name I can't pronounce, but the central finding, John Barge up at Yale, is that these unconscious processes are more important than the conscious processes in many circumstances into determining how we act. And a number which illustrates it, though one shouldn't take it too seriously, is that the human mind is capable of taking in 12 million bits of information in a minute, of which it can be consciously aware of 40. And the rest is being processed subconsciously. And so this worldview, looking at these unconscious processes, I think reminds us of the centrality of a couple things. One, it shows the importance of emotion, the centrality of the way emotion is intertwined with reason. And Antonio Damasio at USC did the famous work, it's been written about many times, a patient named Elliot who lost the ability to process emotion because of a stroke, and as a result could not make a decision, could not make central decisions, did not become hyper-rational intelligent, but became self-destructive and foolish, because the emotions are what allow you to value options. So another patient of Damasio's had an appointment, was going to come back in a week, and Damasio said, "You want to come back Tuesday or Wednesday?" And the guy spent 30 minutes describing whether Tuesday would be a good option or Thursday would be a good option, could not reach a decision because he did not have the ability to value, to render value. It shows how interpenetrated we all are. There's the concept many of you know, mirror neurons, which are controversial, but it's certainly true that we're much more interpenetrated, and to think of us as autonomous individuals is open to question. My favorite story about that is a psychology class played a trick on their professor. He was one of these guys who wanders up and down the stage as he talks, and they decided before class that when he was over here, they would look at him, but when he was over here, they would look down at their notepads. And within 5 minutes, he was basically out the door over there. Didn't know what was happening, but it just felt better over there. And then it introduces the way our decision-making, our perceptions are filled with biases. And my favorite experiment, or my favorite little story about that is a guy at SUNY Buffalo has found that people named Dennis are disproportionately likely to become dentists. People named Lawrence are disproportionately likely to become lawyers. That's why I've named my son President of the United States. And this is because we have, you know, it's not a strong effect, but we have a slight bias toward things which are familiar. And so we're drawn to those things. And so to me, what this does is this whole body of work, if you unite it, gives you a different view of human nature and a different way to look at people and human behavior. And this different way really starts from unconscious processes, really starts from the emotions, and you can trace a life. Not only by seeing the normal way we look at a life, which is, you know, born with a certain IQ, went to certain school, had certain grades, went to a certain college, took certain financial advice, did certain career planning. That's the normal way of describing. because the conscious mind sort of writes our autobiographies and it assigns itself the starring role. But there are the other ways of describing. And you'd start by describing how a girl was born. She's 42 minutes old, and as Alan Meltzoff at Washington has shown, if you lean into a baby who's 42 minutes old and wag your tongue at the baby, she'll wag her tongue back. Because people are born, even at that phenomenally early age, with an essential instinct to mimic each other. And then through the process of, say, nursing, there's a natural rhythm to nursing. And through that process of the rhythm of a nurse and then a pause, a suck, then a pause, you develop a relationship. And that relationship, that dialogue begins so early in life, and it is that sort of dialogue that really forms how a brain is formed. Samuel Taylor Coleridge anticipated all this and had a story, which I think he made up, but it illustrates an important point. He said his then 3-year-old woke up in the middle of the night and screamed out to his mother and said, "Mother, mother, touch me so I can exist." And what that illustrates is that our identities don't come first and then we bond with other people. Relationships come first and the identities come later. And I think that's evident in all sorts of the experiment, and even in the flourishing. There's a famous, very old study that was done in Romanian orphanages, and these were orphanages where they had mentally challenged young people adopted by mothers, and then 4 years later they gave them IQ points, and the kids who were adopted had IQ points 50 points higher than the kids who were left in the orphanage. And it wasn't because the mothers had done tutoring, because those mothers were themselves mentally challenged and living in a different institution. It was simply the love between a mother and a child that had raised the IQ point. And so then you start with these sorts of emotional bonds, and then you go on to attachment. And there's this whole body of attachment theory that I'm sure most of you know about. The 2/3 of the babies at say 18 months or 2 years are securely attached to their mother. If their mother leaves a room, they know how to process that leaving, know how to re-engage when the mother comes back. Another 20% or so are what they call avoidantly attached. And these are kids who really get no response from mother or dad. And one teacher described an avoidantly attached kid as when he would enter a classroom, he would go to the teacher as if it was a sailboat tacking into the wind. He wanted to approach teacher, did not know how to do it. And avoidantly attached kids do much worse in school. And then the 3rd and 4th models are ambivalent or disorganized attachments, and those kids tend to do poorly in school. And so a team at the University of Minnesota tried to predict over one of these longitudinal studies who would graduate from high school at age 42 months simply based on their attachment patterns. And they found they could predict who would graduate from high school with 77% accuracy at 42 months simply by looking at attachment patterns. And so this is all unconsciously the formation of a mind, but has powerful effects on how people are going to do in life. And then the girl grows up, she becomes subject to social norms. Annette Leroux has done the research on this, that there's really 2 sorts of child-rearing mentalities. There's people in my social class, what she calls concerted cultivation, who we spend our weekends driving our kids places. They go to elementary school with these 80-pound backpacks, so if the wind blows them over, they're like beetles stuck there on the ground. And that's one style of child rearing, highly pressured, but actually highly effective in getting kids through college. Another style, which is the more working class style, the attitude is the kid will have a tough life, let the kid relax. And Leroux and she says these are not on the same continuum, these 2 child rearing styles. They're absolutely different styles of raising kids. And at a young age, the working class kids seem to her, they whine less, they seem more relaxed, they seem more attractive, and in some ways they seem more genuine. But the tragedy is for those kids, it's just a less efficient way of cultivating human capital. And by the time they're 22, they've much more likely to have dropped out of school, in part because there's so much less talking in those homes. And again, these are not the things we normally think of as how we get kids through high school, but these are the things that are actually central. And then finally, tomorrow morning, I'm going to go see a friend of mine named Walter Mischel up at Columbia, who is the originator of probably the most famous experiment along these lines, which I'm sure many of you know, which is the marshmallow experiment, which started when he was in Stanford. I'll just tell it quickly. He took 4-year-olds, put them in a room, said to the kids, you can have a marshmallow. I'm going to put this marshmallow on the table in front of you. You can eat this marshmallow now, but I'm going to come back in 10 minutes. If you haven't eaten the marshmallow, I'll give you 2 marshmallows. And he finds that very few kids can wait 10 or 15 minutes. They all want to eat the marshmallow. He shows me a video of saw a little girl trying not to eat the marshmallow. She's banging her head on the table, trying not to eat the marshmallow. Once Michelle was using an Oreo cookie, the little guy carefully opens up the Oreo, carefully eats out the middle, and carefully puts it back on the table. And that kid is now a U.S. Senator. But the scary thing Michelle found in another longitudinal study is that 20 years later, the kids who could wait a long time before eating the marshmallow had much higher college completion rates. And 30 years later, much higher incomes. The kids who could only wait 1 minute, much higher drug and alcohol addiction problems, and much higher incarceration rates. And that's because some kids grow up in homes where actions lead to consequences, and they learn strategies to control their impulses. And what they do is they learn strategies to see the marshmallow in a different way. It's not a marshmallow, it's a cloud. I'm going to put an imaginary frame around the marshmallow. They learn strategies of this sort to see things differently. And so these are another form of really educating the emotions, educating the unconscious process. And you can go all the way through life. You can go to culture. People absorb the mentality of their culture. Another famous differences between the Chinese and the American culture. My 2 favorite experiments here. One is the famous experiment where they took Chinese people and American people and had them look at a fish tank, and they measured the saccades of their eye, the movements of their eyes, and the movements were totally different. And basically what the Chinese people generally did was to describe the context of the fish tank, the atmosphere, the relationship between the fish, and what the Americans did was they just described the biggest fish in there. And two different ways of perceiving the same reality. Another variation on that was they asked people, group these 3 things, and pick out the 2 that are similar, wolf, cow, and grass. And most Americans group the cow and the wolf together because they're both animals. Most Chinese group the cow and the grass together because the cow eats the grass. It has a relationship with the grass. And that, again, the generalization still somewhat true that Chinese who live in China are more likely to see relationships and contexts. Americans are more likely to see subjects. And so these are, again, different ways of seeing the world, what Andy Clark, the philosopher, calls parts of the extended mind. And so then, the girl we're facing is now in adulthood. She's dating. If she were a man, she'd pick out a guy with a 0.7 waist, or a woman with a 0.7 waist-hip ratio, which is the same waist-hip ratio that has lasted through life. But because she's a woman, she likes men who are taller than herself. Online dating, studies of online dating have allowed us to find that women will date men who are 5'6", but that man has to earn $175,000 a year more than a 6-footer to draw even. Don't ask me how I know that. And so again, all of these things, and I'm sort of beating a dead horse, but it's just to treat the way unconscious processes all along guide through life. And I'll just do a few more because I like the stories. I don't care about you guys. As she's meeting this man, she's probably a little more emotionally sensitive to what he's thinking than he is to what she is thinking. And an experiment that amuses me and horrifies me at the same time was done where they took gauze pads and they taped them under the arm, in the armpits of men and women, and then some of the subjects watched a comedy and some of them watched a horror movie. And then they took other subjects who I hope were well paid, and they asked them to sniff the gauze pads and to guess, did the wearer watch a comedy or a horror movie? And it turns out people can do this with far better than chance accuracy, and women are much, much better than men at sniffing the gauze pad test. I'm sure it comes in very handy. Not quite sure how, and then, you know, then she gets a job. She finds herself surrounded by people who have high IQs, but maybe do stupid things. And that's because, as we know now, IQ is nestled in mental and moral dispositions, which are deeper and really affect behavior more than IQ itself does. There's a famous experiment done here at Hunter College High School. And the students had an average IQ of about 157, and they did a longitudinal study of them, expecting these kids to go on to achieve tremendous things. And they did fine, but they did not do tremendous things, because just picking out people with 157 tells you very little about who's going to do well in life. Basically, once you get past 120, it's really a horrible predictor of how you're going to do in real life experiments. What matters is, do you have the ability to be sensitive to when evidence is strong or not strong? Are you emotionally open to counter evidence? These are deeper traits than raw IQ. And then she gets out into the marketplace. She finds herself in the world of behavioral economics, and I'm sure you've seen their work on priming, that if you give people words related to old age, they will walk more slowly. On anchoring, if you go to a wine store and the wine bottle sitting there is $400, you're likely to buy the $90 one, but if it's $30, you're likely to buy the $9 one. And then finally, the effect of arousal. There's an Israeli behavioral economist named Dan Ariely who did another horrifying experiment, the things people will do for science. He took a bunch of laptops, wrapped them in saran wrap, gave them to a bunch of young men and had them watch pornography, and then asked them questions. And in their non-aroused states, he asked them if they would be willing to have sex with a 12-year-old, and 23% said yes. When they were in the aroused state, 46% said yes. He asked them, would you be willing to have sex with someone you disliked? 53 said yes. In the aroused state, 77% said yes. I'm actually horrified by the base numbers, let alone the... And then finally, there's been a great deal of work on morality, and really the consensus, or at least a large body of research on the subject of morality, is that morality doesn't follow the rationalist model we thought it did, which is the folk wisdom model is we have these temptations which are produced by the emotions, and reason is supposed to use willpower in order to master them. The body of work by Jonathan Haidt and others at the University of Virginia and many other places, Mark Hauser at Harvard and such places, is that we have almost an aesthetic sense. We see things and immediately have moral reactions to them. And we can educate those reactions through reading and thinking, but the reaction is instantaneous and aesthetic. So if you ask somebody, would you like to wear Hitler's sweater? Most people have a visceral reaction against that, even though it's just a sweater. If Jonathan Haidt takes a story where he says, suppose a boy and a girl, a brother and sister, go out on a trip, they decide to have sex just as an experiment, nothing happens, no one catches them, they enjoy it, but they decide to never do it again. Do you think that's okay? And people have a visceral and hostile reaction against that they really can't explain why. It's not the result of moral reasoning, it's the result of a reaction which has been, the ground has been prepared for that reaction, and then it is educated and formed by emotion. So anyway, I've run through this long and maybe tedious list of experiments. And to me, what the neuroscience doesn't do, it doesn't give us new views of human nature. What it does do is it vindicates some old views and it delegitimizes some other ones. And if you want my stupid sports version of what I think it does, it would be the French Enlightenment loses, the Scottish Enlightenment wins. And the French Enlightenment is based on reason. You all know it, the encyclopedia, the temple of reason, the idea that we can rise above our emotions into the realm of reason. And that really did inform a lot of policy. You know, precursor would be Plato, but even up to the technocracy of modern age and the methodology of academic work. The Scottish Enlightenment really did not put such great faith in reason. People like Hume, Burke, Smith, and Gibbon believed that reason is the slave to the passions. They believed it was a mistake to distinguish between natural man and artificial man because they believed man and nature is naturally social. We're born for society. We're born interpenetrated. They paid great attention to relationships. They said we have a natural desire to be admired and to be worthy of that admiration. And they also placed a great faith in what Burke would have called epistemological modesty, the idea that human nature and human societies are so complicated, we should be extremely modest about what we can know about them. And so to me, what the whole work in this cognitive field does is it really extends and amplifies a lot of the instincts they knew just from looking at human nature. And when you take it to the realm of public policy, back into my realm, you take it into a realm and you realize that A, we should be modest about what we can know about human behavior because it probably does not follow universal laws, is not reducible to universal methodologies, but is extremely context-driven, a series of if-then formulas and idiosyncratic minds. And the second, and I'm sorry the word socialist has already been taken, but it actually does describe the way we should think about this. The people who call themselves socialists are not socialists, they happen to be statists. And we happen to have lived through 2 generations, I think, of extreme individualism. There was an individualism of the right of Barry Goldwater, which emphasized an economic liberal individualism, the idea that we're individually creating our own lives, the self-made man. And then an individualism of the left, also in the 1960s, which emphasized social individualism, the idea we should come up with our own truths, create our own lifestyles. And we've had this great move of individualism over all this time in the law and in politics and in economics. And yet this body of work shows us the fallaciousness of a lot of that individualism, the way we're deeply interpenetrated, and that the policies that work best take that into account and work on the relationships between people. And a lot of these policies, and this is the danger, are highly paternalistic. Nurse-family partnerships work. If you take people who are in poverty, a lot of what you're doing is what the experts call parent neutral. But really it's displacing the parent, the relationship and the culture of the parent with a different culture. One of the most successful institutions in the country are KIPP academies, excuse me, these private schools. And they're explicitly built on the Michelle Marshmallow test. And they teach kids the strategies for self-control. You go to a KIPP classroom, they will spend an hour and a half teaching the kids how to walk into a classroom, another hour and a half on how to walk down the hallway, another hour and a half on how to look people in the eye or how to nod when in agreement. It is the basic social skills. And they're really taking kids from disorganized backgrounds and giving them old-fashioned, disciplined bourgeois skills. And they're taking the things that middle-class kids learn unconsciously and doing it very explicitly, and they have tremendous effects. And so what you have is a whole series of policies working on these sorts of relationships, working on the soft side. I'm going to speak tomorrow to David Petraeus, the general from Iraq and Afghanistan, and what was interesting is to hear him talk about the COIN strategy, the counterinsurgency strategy. War is not about killing bad guys, it's about how to nurture the relationships within villages in Afghanistan and Iraq. It's an entirely different way of thinking about war fighting. And you can go through policy after policy, from suburban zoning to education to mentoring programs, even to institution building, and really think about people, how you nurture relationships rather than treat people as individuals. And I think in education, this is the area in which it's furthest along. And it's for the first time since I've been covering education, it's really beginning to produce these tremendous results. And so I think we're at the beginning of this stage where we take the body of work that's being done and start applying it to the wider world. I think Wall Street would be a good place to apply it to. There's a guy at MIT named Andrew Lowe who measured traders' brains after 3 up days, and they've got so much dopamine flowing through them, they think they're gods. It is I find it, for someone who's outside the science and who doesn't pretend to be able to describe what's happening in what region of the brain, I find that just a tremendously renewed understanding of what human nature is, which is, I think, is going to affect policy and in the way we see the world entire. So thank you very much. Now, I guess there's time for, I tried to talk briefly since I know many people are doctors in the room and you didn't come to hear me talk, you came to hear yourselves talk. And so, I'm just kidding. So if there are any questions, comments, rebuttals, comments on King Tut, there seems to be a microphone over there.
Would you comment on the article about PowerPoint and the general's reaction to it?
I actually saw the chart. I must say I was in Afghanistan about 9 months ago. The question was about PowerPoint. There was an article in the Times on PowerPoint. You may have seen the chart. It was a completely incomprehensible chart about the flow structure, the power structure of our forces in Afghanistan. And it is amazing. You go from one meeting to another, and you're sitting around with these burly Marines and guys from the 82nd Airborne, and they just one PowerPoint slide after another. And if there's a way of communicating that is more likely to dehumanize the subject you're talking about, I don't know it. Because everything does have to be reduced to these bullet points. Some of you probably know of Jerome Bruner, this writer from a few years ago, who said there are two ways of thinking. There's the paradigmatic mode, which is the mode of argument, and then there's the narrative mode. And I think we are all naturally better at the narrative mode. And the narrative mode is a way of telling stories which enables you to give much deeper shadings to situations and to emotions and to relationships and all that soft stuff. And the PowerPoint mode utterly defeats that. And it's funny when you go there now, they're aware of it. And by the way, the Army is an amazing story of an institution which has utterly revolutionized its thinking. In really the space of 7 years, from a top-down institution really organized around killing people, to a decentralized decision structure organized around community building. And that's just a tremendous change for a bunch of guys who went in there, men and women, really to kill people. That's what they're into. And I say that with all due respect. But it's remarkable. And they've tried to change this, so now you often go to the meetings and they have a jar in the middle of on the table, and if somebody uses an acronym, they have to put a quarter in the jar. Because they're trying to change the way they talk and think. But they got a long way to go. Believe me, the PowerPoints are unbelievable. I'm sure if you go online and see the Gettysburg Address in PowerPoint, they've got all these parodies that are out there.
If we are in need of interaction between people, what are we going to do with a generation of children who have nothing hardly but computer screens and things you do with their phones?
Right. That's a very good question. The question is, does a generation so enraptured by social media online, do they lose something face-to-face? To me, that makes sense to me, and I've looked into it. I have to say, so far, I find no evidence of it. And I think it is the case that they use social media as a way to arrange face-to-face. You know, they all have the problem, which we all are aware of, that people can't see your gestures, your facial expressions when you're joking in a text or an email, and therefore they get insulted by what is meant to be a joke. That seems to be a general phenomenon. But it seems nonetheless true that the desire to congregate is so strong that even though they may be, you know, my kids are, I tell people running for president, I always say, if you want to win this election, just announce today that you will ban texting for kids after 10 p.m. Every parent in America will vote for you because they all hate the idea of their kids texting all night. But it seems to be they are arranging face-to-face meetings. And as far as I can tell, there's really no diminution of social skills associated with this. I must say, if you want to feel good about the country, look at the social indicators for young people. The teenage pregnancy rate is down, teenage suicide rate is down, violence is down, crime is down among teenagers. Divorce rates for people under 30 are about a third lower than divorce rates for people over 30 after the same number of years of marriage. It's really an impressive generation. They're all going to have the biggest midlife crisis in human history in about 5 years. But until that point, they're incredibly impressive.
You started off telling us that personal relationships with Congress are much more important than policy, rational thinking. What role, if any, does ethics play in Congress?
What role does ethics play in Congress? I'm also tempted to say it would be a good idea. Be an interesting experiment. You know, I guess I'll say a couple things. First, when you go to lunch with a member of Congress, you always walk away with the phrase, reasonable in private, in your head. In private, they all are aware of the weaknesses of their own position and the strengths of the opposing position. But in public, it is impermissible to admit that. And so you get, I think, again, in this team mentality. Now, would they... well, let me put it this way. There's a woman who I interviewed a couple times named Deborah Price, who was a moderate Republican from Columbus, Ohio. And her district in Columbus was phenomenally tight. And so she would win by 500 votes year after year after year. And when you're in that kind of district, you don't run your campaign, the consultants come in and run your campaign for you. And some people refuse to let the consultants run their campaign, and those people are called former congressmen, because they're bastards, but they know how to win. And so she was describing to me her campaign, and this woman who'd lost her 9-year-old daughter to cancer. And so there's a depth there. And she was describing her campaign to me, and she said, one day I'm running ads against my opponent's running ads against me, my 93-year-old mother calls me up and says, Deborah, I want you to know I'm ashamed of you for the ads you're running. They're despicable. And she shows me a leaflet she had run against her opponent, and she holds it up like a diaper. And believe me, her opponents were running just as bad as against her, but she was really bothered by the stuff she did. And she said, you know, you don't win, you don't serve. And I do think it is genuinely the case that most people in Congress are in it for the right reasons. They just want to serve. I flew up here last Thursday night. I was on the last shuttle from DC to New York, and I would say there were 8 New York congressmen on that flight. And we got in, because of sitting on the runway, we got in like 12. And they do that every week. It's just a rotten life. And you wouldn't do it unless you thought you were doing good. And so I think most of them are in it for the right reasons, but they're in a system with continual character challenges. And I mentioned the teamism and the need to win, and the need to satisfy what the public wants to hear. And they're continually challenged by that. And whether they succeed or not is really based on an individual basis, I would say. But I would say their hearts are generally good, and we're probably a little too cynical about them in general.
Is the strange implication of your last answer that it would be better if congressmen voted secretly on bills?
Yeah, we would have better government. We might not. I mean, that would bring its own government, its own problems, obviously, because you would lose touch with the idea of democracy. But nonetheless, well, let's say today I was on the train up here talking to people about the deficit. Everyone knows how we're going to solve the deficit. We're going to have probably a VAT tax or some tax, and we're going to means test entitlements. And if you could have private voting, we'd solve that tomorrow. And as it stands now, I see no way we're going to solve it. I think we're going to have a big fiscal crisis at some point in the next decade or so. And that's to avoid what I think is the central moral challenge of the age. That would be a good way to do it. But you're not in favor of it, but I understand the question. And, you know, again, to get back to Burke, it's, do I represent your views, or do I represent you to think for you? And especially in the media age, you represent to the views more. I mean, it's called the House of Representatives. And the people in that body are no smarter or dumber than the average American. They are representative.
Very strange comments I think you made about the secret voting in Congress. Let me try to outline for you maybe an alternative. Shortly after Dunkirk, Winston Churchill said, let us not kid ourselves. This was a military disaster of the worst kind. Do we have anybody today in politics who can make such statements?
No. There wouldn't be a consultant. You know, here's one story about George Bush, actually. He was asked in one of the debates, can you tell us some of the mistakes you made as president? And he dodged the question. And as soon as the debate was over and the TV cameras were off, he went to the woman who asked him the question and said, I just want you to know I've made a ton of mistakes, but I cannot say that. And the view among the consultants, and this is Democratic and Republican consultants, is once you do that, you lose control of the debate forever. And then it doesn't satisfy people. It inflames your critics and demoralizes your friends. And so it is better never to admit a mistake, even though privately you have to admit them.
Let me follow up. You mentioned in Alison Gopnik's book that she talks there about the moral judgment of the child. And I wonder if you have views as to what happens between the time the child has that sense of moral judgment and the child becomes an adult and refuses to take positions and refuses to express a sense of integrity. I was coaching a young kids soccer once, and I was the referee in the game, and I made a call. I didn't quite see who kicked the ball out of bounds, and I made the wrong call. And this little girl looked at me and she said, why did we get the ball? I kicked it out. Oh, I said, oh, that's fine, then they get it out. The amazing thing that I was struck that her father, who was on the sideline, said to the child, it's not your job to referee. Let the referee make the call.
Yeah.
And the question was this, what happens to us between the girl and the time that George Bush was unable to say,
right,
he makes mistakes?
Yeah. Well, the question was about what happens the time between children who, especially in youth sports, are usually the moral, normal ones, and what happens between that moment and the time they're adults when they're the bastards. And I have 3 kids because of my wife's genes who are very good at sports, and the stories I could tell you. I guess I would say a couple things. First, I do believe people are born with a set of natural moral concerns of which fairness is. It's not like you're born with an awareness of fairness, but the ground is prepared so you learn it quickly. And kids are phenomenally fanatical about fairness at a very early age. And there's never been a society where people are admired for being unfair. There's never been a society where people are admired for running away in battle. So I do believe there is a universal and deeply ingrained set of moral senses. But I wouldn't want to romanticize childhood. I've read some study or some people who've written that the most violent age of all is 2 and 3. It's just that they can't do much damage to each other at that age. But they do fight a lot. So there's, like all ages, there is there's ambivalence. I mean, if you take babies in a nursery at a few days old, a baby will cry if it hears another baby crying. It will not cry if it hears a recording of its own voice crying, because the natural sympathy doesn't get aroused. And so there is an innate moral sense, but there is also, but I don't believe we're born naturally good. I think we are born to compete, to be admired, and that competition is also deeply ingrained in us. So I wouldn't necessarily say we move from virtue to vice as we get older, but in the field of childhood sports, we certainly do. I'm not quite sure that is, except for when you're watching your kids play sports, it arouses a really savage nature that is more savage than any other realm of sport. But I don't want to suggest, I think we have moral natures which last through life.
Any potential for adopting the kinds of psychological and neurological insights that you were talking about into the political sphere, into addressing, so that we can bring out more the private side of our elected officials, diminish the public side?
Yeah, well, as I say, I think there are areas where it's already happening, and education is the most. But one of the main barriers, to my mind, and even the military, I mentioned, it's happening. And believe me, the people in the military are very alert to all this research. They're very impressive in that way. In Washington, because it is especially a hyper-male culture, the high status goes to people who write about banks and guns. And so, if you believe me, I've spoken to probably every, in fact, I know I've spoken to every single senator about early childhood education, which I think is essential. And they pat you on the head like you're trying to rescue lost puppies, and then they want to go off and talk about appropriations. And that's because that's what they think is important. It's also because that's what they control. They control money. And knowing how to control or alter relationships is actually a phenomenally difficult thing. Daniel Patrick Moynihan had a saying, which is also justly famous, which is the central liberal truth is that culture matters, or the central conservative truth is that culture matters most. The central liberal truth is that government can change culture. And to adapt that, it would be the central evolutionary truth is that the unconscious matters most. The central human truth is that reason can educate the unconscious. But exactly how you do that is phenomenally difficult. We have that barrier. The second barrier, which I'll just mention quickly, is we have a vast apparatus, especially for young people, to get them into the right college, to give them the right SAT class, to give them the right career training. The most important decision, as everybody in this room probably knows, that they will make is who to marry. We have absolutely no apparatus to help them with that decision. We have no apparatus on how to develop good character. I did a story for The Atlantic several years ago on Princeton. And I asked the professors, do you help your kids develop character? And they said, well, we think they should develop, but we don't, that's not really our job. Well, it was Princeton's job 7 years ago, but I think now we just don't know what to say. We've lost the vocabulary. And I think that's because we've lost touch with some of the issues which I talked about. And so there's a lot of work to be done. But I personally think this work is so compelling that it's already having a big effect on economics, which is a bastion of hyper-rationalism. It's having an effect on military culture. It's having an effect on the law. And so I think its effects are spreading gradually, but it has to overcome the wall of masculine insensitivity, which is a pretty thick wall.
I'm wondering if you could share any sense you might have of what's on the horizon for Don Berwick.
For who?
For Don Berwick, the president's nominee for CMS. Rumors are that Berwick will be attacked.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not informed on the subject. I've been lost in the hippocampus for a year, so if I could tell one story about male insensitivity, another favorite of mine, this is a piece of brain research which I am certain is apocryphal, but I enjoy it nonetheless, which is they had a bunch of middle-aged men, they put them in fMRI machines and had them watch a horror movie, and then they asked them to describe their feelings toward their wives. and the fMRI scans were exactly the same, just raw terror in both activities. So I don't know if that's true or not.
David, on behalf of everybody, I want to just say this has been a spectacular evening, and I can't believe how many things you know so much about. My question is, how many hours a night do you sleep?
I sleep a lot. I don't watch much TV except for sports. So.